Hey guys, it's Mr. Stringham. A lot of people messaged in and asked for an example that was not Roman related since you have the option to choose an event that's not related to Rome. So I put this one together to kind of give you an example. And this is going to be on the Great Seattle Fire, which happened on June 6, 1889. It's a pretty big part of our history here in the Pacific Northwest. So I thought it'd be kind of interesting. And I used to talk about this a lot when I was a tour guide in Seattle. So let's go ahead and get started. Learning targets. I understand how the Great Seattle Fire started and why it spread so quickly. I understand why the city was unable to contain the fire, and I understand how big an impact the fire had on the Pacific Northwest region. So by the end of this video, you should be able to answer all three of those things, and if you were asked to write a response or something like that, you should be able to write a response to any of those statements. Some context about the world in 1889 that's kind of important to know. The Dakotas, so North and South Dakota, Montana, and Washington become states in 1889. Nellie Bly breaks the record for traveling around the world in 72 days and 6 hours. The Eiffel Tower in France opens for the 1889 Paris World Fair. Kodak cameras begin selling the first flexible rolls of film. So before you had a smartphone and it was just like a file saved on your phone, you'd have to get the film developed. And so this is the beginning of that kind of movement. And then Thomas Edison screens the first movie, which kind of goes in line with the rolls of film. So they're just now starting to kind of get those entertainment ideas that we kind of take for granted are starting to really develop around this time in 1889. Civil War just ended before this, and so it's important to kind of keep in mind where we're at technology wise. It took Nellie Bly 72 days and 6 hours to get around the world. So obviously the technology is not going to be near as close as technology that we have today. So just kind of keep that in mind as we're learning about this story. So how could this have happened? There's kind of two photos here on the right-hand side that show the fire raging in Seattle. On the first photo, you can see some firefighters and people trying to fight it. And then the second photo, you can kind of see how big the smoke is from far away. People could see the smoke in the fire as far as Tacoma. So it was a pretty big event. When settlers first arrived in the Pacific Northwest, they noticed one resource that was in abundance: trees, or more specifically, lumber. At this time in 1889, the Pacific Northwest was heavily entrenched as a logging town. As a result, almost everything in Seattle was made of wood, because that was your main building material. And on June 6, 1889, would prove disastrous for the city of Seattle, as well as everyone who depended on the shipping ports. So Seattle isn't just a big metropolitan city with lots of people there. There's a lot of items and resources that come through Seattle and are shipped out to other places. And so we're a huge hub for this region of the world. We're the closest port to Asia by a full day, closer than California, and we do more shipping modern day with Asia than any other port in the United States. And so Seattle is a pretty important hub. And when the fire happens, it interrupts that hub and that ability to move resources from Seattle onto boats into other places. And so that's a huge impact. The entire West Coast region at this time would have been impacted by the fire in Seattle, as well as other countries, primarily in Asia, where trade and immigration was happening. That would kind of prevent a lot of things from getting moved out of Seattle and shipped to where they need to go. This is a photo of Elliott Bay in 1889 after the fire on top. And then this is the same view modern day below. So Elliott Bay, I put a little arrow and a little label. If you were to go all the way across the water, it's probably where that ferry is heading, right there, right? If it went all the way across the water to right here, it would go to Bainbridge Island. Or if it went around kind of this curve that way, it would be heading towards Bremerton. So that's sort of the view. So when you pull in from the ferry, if you're leaving from Bremerton, the dock is going to be kind of somewhere right over here, probably a little bit further left that way. And so it just kind of shows you the difference between, obviously, in 1889 after the fire, there's almost nothing left. And then it's kind of cool to see how quickly the city has recovered. Obviously, there's skyscrapers, and this is actually kind of an old view because there's actually a lot more skyscrapers in Elliott Bay in this region now than there were during this photo. So, the story of the Great Seattle Fire. I got my information from the University of Washington Content Library, and I just put that source right here, right? And I would like you guys to cite where you're getting your information from too when you're doing your research project. So this is sort of the story of what happens. The weather in the days leading up to the fire proved to be unusually nice for the Pacific Northwest. This hot summer weather would ensure all the wood in the city was extremely dry. It'd been a long time since they had had rain, and so everything in the city was hot, and all the wood was super dry. There wasn't any moisture in it, which kind of makes it perfect for firewood. If you ever had like a shed or like a tarp where you keep your firewood, it helps it kind of air out so that when you go to stick it in the fire, it will actually burn. Um, it's sort of the same effect here. On June 6, in 1889, around 2:15 p.m., John Back, a Swedish immigrant, was heating up a bucket of glue when it accidentally boiled over the edge and made contact with a collection of wood chips and turpentine. Turpentine is super flammable. It's got some chemicals in it that make it catch fire really, really quickly. And then the fact that it was near those wood chips in a wood building kind of just compounds on itself. In a matter of minutes, the entire building was engulfed in flames. Soon, the entire downtown region of Seattle would be ablaze. Soon, a few liquor stores and bars would catch fire. The alcohol in both businesses would explode as the fire burned hotter and faster. And every time it would burn one of those businesses, it would just fuel the fire even more. And it was incredibly hard for people to stop the fire. This is a map of the downtown Seattle area. The area in red is all of the area that was destroyed by the fire in 1889. And then I labeled some other things on the map just to kind of give you a perspective of where everything is at. So the most important thing on there is going to be the Seattle Ferry Terminal. It's probably the one you're most familiar with, which is going to be down here. And so if you were to take the ferry from Bremerton or Bainbridge, that's where you would pull in. Right here, you can kind of see the name Yesler. Yesler Street is a pretty common avenue that runs all the way up Seattle there. And I used to work on that street, so that's kind of how I know the area. If you're going to go further left, or where this arrow is pointing here with Space Needle, Space Needle is going to be that way. Quite a few blocks, maybe like a 20-minute walk. And then if you go north, you're going to hit the University of Washington. That's going to be more like 30 minutes. It's not really centrally downtown in Seattle. And then if you're to go over here to the right, that's where the Mariners and the Seahawks play. That's where the stadiums are. Or if you've taken the ferry and seen those really big cranes pulling containers off the container ships, they're going to be right in this kind of little passage of water right here. And then I also highlighted in yellow on the top left here one city block, because you might not know what a city block is if you grow up in a rural area like Belfair or you've never made it to a big city. Everything is gridded out on blocks, and a block is this area right here. It's just that one square, basically the space between streets here. One of those blocks is considered a block. Kind of makes sense. So you can kind of get a sense of how many blocks were destroyed when you look at this map of the area that's shaded in red. It's pretty large area. Seattle Underground. These are some pictures from the Seattle Underground. And I'll start with the one on the right, actually, first, with the people walking down the stairs. If you've ever walked around Seattle, you probably see these staircases by entrances to shops in downtown. And this is kind of how you access the Seattle Underground. I don't think like regular kind of like civilians or people can go down there. I think you have to be part of a tour group just because it's probably like somewhat dangerous down there just because there's old buildings and construction, and you have to be down there with someone that kind of knows their way around. But there's lots of these entrances all across Seattle. A lot of them are locked. And then, like the Seattle Underground Tour Company has access to a few entrances where they can take you under. This picture in the middle, you'll see these tiles and with the light kind of shining through. If you're walking down the sidewalk in Seattle, a lot of times you'll see these kind of, they call them like stumbling stones that are kind of embedded into the sidewalk, and they're like this blue kind of teal glass, and you can't really see through it, but it does let light come through. Below that glass is the Seattle Underground that you're walking across. Some of them the city has added to match the old ones, but they're not actually like, there's nothing below it. But the older ones are genuine, and below that is where the Seattle Underground is. So when you're walking in the streets of Seattle, up here below you, there might be people walking around taking the Seattle Underground tour, which is kind of cool. It's pretty interesting. And then this photo all the way here on the left is just sort of another view of the underground. You can see there's a lot of old machinery and equipment and stuff down there that was just kind of left from the fire. And when the city burnt down, they just built, they put a layer of concrete on top of this and kind of just built on top of it. And that's actually pretty common in cities. Mexico City in Mexico is really famous for that. You'll have like a skyscraper that has building structures from like 5 different decades of history, because they just keep building and adding on top of old like Mayan temples or Aztec temples. They just build right on top of that, incorporate that into the current building. And so you'll see that a lot in London. They have an underground section that in World War II the British used to turn into bunkers to hide from the Nazis during the Battle of Britain, because the Nazis, the Luftwaffe, the Air Force, was bombing Britain, and so they went underground and set up bases and bunkers and shelters and stuff like that. So it's actually a lot more common to have kind of an underground than one might think. One thing that people ask a lot is, why was the fire so destructive? On top of just everything being made out of wood, it wasn't just the buildings that were made out of wood. The hoses that hooked up to the fire hydrants that ran underground, the pipes, a lot of them were actually made out of hollowed out logs, because that's what they had, and it was easy to haul out logs and line them up next to each other and create, a long pipe pretty quickly to carry water to and from. But what happens when the city starts to burn down is that a lot of those pipes get burnt up with the city. And without the pipes, the fire hydrants are pretty useless, and they're not actually able to pull any water from the fire hydrants. So not only is this fire burning and raging, they don't have any way to put it out. So what happens is the fire department will actually take the hoses down to Elliott Bay, which is that photo I showed you earlier where the ferry was, and pump seawater out of the ocean, out of the sound, and use it to fight the fire. That was sort of the only option that they had. So that's sort of the Great Seattle Fire. That's sort of what happened. It lines up really well with your guideline that I gave you. I talk about John Back, someone that was involved in this, kind of give you some details about what happened in the fire, what was the cause of it, why weren't they able to combat it, the importance of it, and then kind of give you a little bit of extra information about the Seattle Underground. So I hope this gives you a pretty good example of what I am expecting on your project. You do have this week and next week to work on it. So take your time with it. Make sure you're checking your spelling, making sure things are spelled correctly. And please make sure you're citing your sources. Tell me where you're getting your information from. And you can do that by just copy and pasting the link that you used for the website on there. That way I can go back and kind of check that. And I think that's it. Thanks. Have a great day. Bye.